Alright, everybody, welcome to another Developer Livecast here on the Game Wisdom YouTube channel. Oop, is that me? I think I'm hearing myself in the background.
Oh, how can I fix that? Oh, how can I fix that?
I think it may be picking you up. Oh, I think Alexis just left. That's a good sign.
Okay, so this. Right.
It's the madness of going live. At least I didn't do it this time, Oscar. But while he's finishing it, wait. Oh.
Okay, I hear you, and
Yep.
you can't hear you, I hope?
Yep, I'm good. I only hear myself now. That's good. Alright. Well, that's always the joy of doing things live. So, we got a great cast for you now that these sound issues have been taken care of. My guest tonight is formerly from Fail Better Games and was a creator behind Fallen London as well as Sunless Seas. He is currently set to release his next game, the Cultist tabletop roguelike-esque game Cultist Simulator. It had a very successful Kickstarter, it's been on itch.io, and it's set to come out on Steam this May. So please welcome to the stream, Alexis Kennedy.
Thank you very much.
Hey Alexis, how are you doing today?
Well, kind of 8 out of 10, I think.
Let me just raise you up a little bit here. There we go. Alright, so it's only been a while. I think didn't we speak like a few years ago? I think when you were still working on Sunless Seas, or I could have been thinking of Liam.
I think it was a podcast with some other folks.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I know I've spoken to Chris several times. Trying to get Liam back on for a cast. We're trying to figure out a topic to discuss for like an hour or so. But did we ever speak together, or no? Or is this our first time?
I think at my age, my memory fails me. I thought, were you one of a panel of a number of folk on a podcast? I can't remember the names of anyone involved, but I think we might have 3 or 4 years ago.
Again, 3 or 4 years is like an eternity in game dev time, so I wouldn't be shocked if we've forgotten, or I've forgotten as well. I've lost track as well. But I know that you have to get going in about an hour, so I don't want to spend too long waxing on memory here. So to get things started with, Alexis, for people who don't know who you are, could you talk a little bit about your background and what is Cultist Simulator?
So I founded Fail Better Games back in 2009. I made Sunless Sea. I made Fallen London pretty much in my daughter's bedroom, although she wasn't in it at that point. It was still in their room. And I scrabbled a unusual narrative web-based game after some years into ultimately a niche successful cult thing, and then we made Sunless Sea, which did really well. And in the meantime, we did a bunch of work with BioWare and the BBC and Channel 4, Random House, sort of storytelling narrative projects, and I guess built a reputation at the studio for narrative work, for choice-based narrative in particular, interactive narrative. And then 7 years into running Fail Better, I decided that I was tired being a manager and wanted to go back to being a designer, because by that point Fail Better had grown to a fair old size. And I sold up, left, and spent a year being a sort of narrative writing Ronin. I did some work for BioWare, I did some work for Telltale, I did a story pack for Paradox, and then I came back to run the Kickstarter for Cultist Simulator. So in fact, I did a JavaScript prototype for Cultist Simulator back in 2016. I did a limited, simple Unity alpha just to prove the concept, end of 2016, and then the whole thing sat in hiatus for a year until I picked it up again in September. Ran the Kickstarter, which, as you said, went well, and I'm making it, and it is due out in 42 days because. So Weather Factory is just two people, full time, me and Dottie Bevan, my co-founder. And what we really wanted to do was a series of short, sharp narrative experiments with low production costs that would hopefully strike a chord, and then move on to the next one. So we're going to support Cultist Simulator with post launch patches and DLC, but we've already got more projects lined up. And the key thing, I think, is an indie dev. It's very easy to sink a lot of time into trying to make the biggest, most ambitious game you possibly can, and it's very difficult potentially to make your money back. So Cultist Simulator, I'm known for my writing. I wanted to make something text-focused and writing-focused, and I wanted to make something in less than a year. And the total elapsed dev time on Cultist Simulator is 10 months. And we didn't want to mess about with the early access. We've got a beta for Kickstarter backers and some pre-purchasers, but we haven't done Steam early access. We're just going to launch on Steam, hopefully done a creditable job, and so we go from there.
All right. Definitely a very interesting journey there, Alexis. And I guess my first question is, when it came to Cultist Simulator, did you have like the idea in the back of your mind for a while, or did it come like after you left Fail Better?
So the idea, there's really three strands in Cultist Simulator, and one is the kind of thing I've always been interested in, and that is the idea of doing a choice-based game where you don't do the kinds of things you normally do in games. So that was Fallen London, all the way. Fallen London, you are in a city, but you're not navigating a 3D environment. You're making decisions like what to write poetry about, or who to invite to dinner, or sometimes which monster to kill. But I wanted to provide something that felt more like navigating a story about somebody's life. And Cultist Simulator, again, you're sitting in your study a lot of the time, researching lore, summoning creatures, sending minions out to try to deal with investigators who are trying to hunt you down, this sort of thing. And again, you're not moving around a 3D world. You're making the kind of choices that you make in your life, or the characters make in a book, rather than being concerned with spatial navigation particularly. Because games often, not always, I mean lots and lots of exceptions to this, but lots of games drift towards spatial navigation. If you're doing text-centric games, then it makes a lot of sense to be focusing on abstract things or conversational things or more implicit choices. So that's always something I've been interested in. And then when I left Fail Better, when I was looking at my next project, I'd been playing an incremental game called the Kittens Game, which is a sort of wonderful parody of incremental games as they stood in 2016, where you start out as kittens in a catnip forest, and rather as with Candy Box or a dark room, you build up your kittens in the catnip forest to the point where they have an industrial revolution and a space program and then time travel and they're summoning elder gods. And I wanted to do an incremental game, a clicker game. And I started messing around with somebody summoning entities and combining lore, and it just became apparent really quickly that the kind of design I had wasn't going to fit in a clicker game. I wanted something much less linear and much more sprawly. And the third thing was I played a couple of games over the years that did interesting things with crafting mechanics, with combining stuff that had unexpected outcomes. So one thing way back when was Doodle God, where you combine disparate elements to create results, but there's no resource management element, right? You just discover a combination and then you've succeeded or not, and there's no underlying law. And another thing was Andrew Plotkin's Hadean Lens, which has a sort of alchemy simulator in it, where there's a very limited degree of resource management and an awful lot of complex, interesting underlying law. So I was interested in the sort of choices that emerge when it isn't clear what choices you're going to make. A lot of the work I've done in the past is a traditional choice-based narrative where it says, here's a situation, you're on a podcast, which are these three things you're going to say. And Cultist Simulator, it's more that you take, for example, one item which represents your experience in the past, another item which represents the person you're talking to, another item which represents a strategic tack you might take. You combine them and something else pops out. So I wanted something where you're making much more spread out choices that tie back into resource management.
Interesting. I just love it, Lex, that one of your ideas was a cat-based game, because I remember when I talked with Chris Barassa from Darkest Dungeon, he said that they were joking about doing Brightest Kittens. So there's definitely a trend. Is there a cat-based trend among indie developers these days that I missed?
So I think, so I wasn't down to do a cat-based game. I was inspired by the Kittens game just because it did an incremental approach, a clicker-based approach, interestingly. But I think a lot of indie devs, by no means all, are cat people, because a lot of indie devs have either chosen to set up on their own or have left a larger studio to try to make it on their own. So I think there is something about the independence of feline critters that appeals. And I know Lottie, my co-founder, is particularly excited about Mineko's Night Market, which a studio over in Vancouver are making. Humble publishing us, they're also publishing Mineko. And I think that is a very, very distant cousin to Cultist Simulator in terms of it being a life simulator its own way, although their approach is much more sort of Harvest Moon and much less summoning creatures in the screaming void.
And speaking about summoning said creatures, for people listening to us right now, what is the basic gameplay of Cultist Simulator?
You take a thing, you use a verb on it, and something pops out. And then you take the things that pop out and you combine those and more things pop out. And occasionally the game will pick up, not occasionally, often the game will pick up the things that have popped out and try to do things back to you. So that's a very abstract level, but that's the underlying mechanic for the whole game, that you take cards, you combine them, you get different cards out, and then that tells a story. So here's an example of that. You put your you've got a card which represents lore that you've learned from a hidden bookshop. You put that in your talk verb, and it pops out an acquaintance who you then put in your cult object, which you put back in your talk verb, and you find another bit of lore so you can recruit them to the cult. But that generates notoriety, which gets picked up by a suspicion verb that's circling over on the edge. So that then pops out an inspector of police who starts trying to gather more notoriety to create evidence to bring you to trial. So you send out a cultist to try to destroy the evidence. The cultist fails, the cultist dies, a corpse card pops out of the cultist dying. You take the corpse card, you put it in a ritual card slot, some cards have slots, you put that in the work verb, you summon a burgeoning dead, which is a sort of zombie with leaves bursting from its eyes. You send that out to murder the police inspector. It fails. That increases notoriety further. He gets damning evidence, which the suspicion verb sucks up, which means they begin a trial. So you then use one of the favours that you've got, because of the starting condition you created, in order to use your connections to wiggle the way out of prison. And then you drive the inspector mad by sending him another summon spirit after him. So he once he's lost his mind, you can imprison him, and then you can suck his life force out in order to fuel your own ascension into an immortal. But one of the key things about this is it's a deliberately stately game. So there are usually, whenever you set a card combination going, a timer starts, and the timer usually runs a minute, and you've usually got 4 or 5 timers running at any one time. One of the streamers who played it said it's a bit like trying to manage a whole bunch of microwaves, but at any point one of the microwaves could explode and something will try to eat you with the tentacles like bursting out of the microwave. And so what this means is that if the timers are about a minute and there are 5 or 6 of them at any one time, usually something happens in the game about 10 to 12 seconds. And also, people know that a thing is going to happen in about 10 to 12 seconds, so they can see the timer counting down. So you can pause the game, you can move cards around while it's paused, but nothing happens until you unfreeze time. So it's always counting down. I really wanted to create a sense of anxiety in the player. You're always conscious of the limited time, and you're always conscious that at any point the police may pop up, or your despair verb might grab another dread card and try to use that to end you, or your summoning might break free, or something like that.
Very interesting, and it sounds like it's going to be a very replayable game in terms of just what happens on each play. I guess in terms of like a general play of Cultist Simulator, like how long does a typical run last?
So I was aiming for about 3 hours for a successful run, and for about half an hour for a failed run, and I think at the moment the successful runs are pushing a bit longer than 3 hours. And so I have a history of making hybrid games that don't fit neatly into one genre. And one of the issues of this is is that people's expectations and also my design goals end up at odds. So what I'm grappling with at the moment is how to create an experience that is balanced as a sort of roguelite, where you have random elements and you have a different playthrough each time, with something that is predictable enough to be a narrative experience and a game with puzzle elements. It's a bit of both, and I think that's okay, especially because the way the victory conditions work is there are multiple endings to each game, and depending on which ending, good or bad, you found, different start conditions are available the next one. So a lot of replayability in there, but I think the balance is still going to be up and down at launch, and that's one thing I want to keep addressing afterwards, because finding that balance of replayability versus crafted experience is super tricky, especially as a solo team.
Yeah, I'm glad.
Solo team, a small team.
I'm glad you brought that up, Alexis, because that was going to be my next question for you. Because again, one of the challenges, as you just said, is the fact that you're trying to balance random or replayable elements with a crafted or narrative-based design. And it can be very hard, I think, for a lot of developers to get that to work. Because as you said, if it's too random, then the story makes no sense. If it's too fixed, then the player knows if, story event X happens, I just do, choice A and B, and that will get through it every time. I guess so far with what you've done with Cultist Simulator, I guess how are you trying to, fit these two elements together?
So the fundamental level, and this is the approach I took in For London and Southern Sea, is that you get atoms of story that make sense at the level of individual atoms, and then those hang together in a larger space where they're loosely connected by the resources they spit out and the resources they consume. And that's one of the things I'm very interested in as a designer is finding ways that resource management and resource consumption combinations can imply story. So the example I just gave, there are lots of things that can produce notoriety. If you recruit another cultist, that can produce notoriety. If you summon a spirit, if you write an article for a patron that's going to earn you some money, writing an essay on some particular facet of the game's lore, that can bring you its reputation. If you consume somebody to fuel one of the ascensions, lots of these things produce notoriety. And then there are a number of things you can do with notoriety. You can use a cultist to try to spin it away, or if you leave it in the game, it's like to be picked up by one or another hunter or one of the detectives who will then try to use it to end you. And the game doesn't know or care where the notoriety came from. As far as the detective is concerned, there's evidence of your crimes, and there's a chance every turn they may turn that into evidence, which they may then use to bring you to trial. So the game has this very loose idea of consequence and outcome. And that means there's space for the player to interpret the story in a way that makes sense to them. But the game is giving them a clear set of cause and effect relationships, right? It's not just saying, here are some concepts, here are some cards to play with, make up your own story, this is improv. It's saying, given these series of events, fill in the gaps. And one of the things I've been saying for years about the approach to storytelling I enjoy is I call it fires in the desert. The idea is you've got a desert. If you were to view a desert from above at night, it's speckled with campfires. You'd see the campfires in the darkness, and you might see travelers making their way between the campfires. And the campfires are the moments of experience that a game developer provides the player. But how the player gets from one campfire to another is devious and uncertain. And that journey in the dark through the campfires only belongs to the player. The developer not only doesn't ordain what happens there, they can't ordain what happens there. That has to be the player's personal experience. So the general approach is to provide a series of loosely connected story atoms, provide meaningful cause and effect, and see that the player let the player make the interpretation. But the problem with this works pretty well, and this is like the 6th game I've made that takes, broadly speaking, this approach. But the problem is the balance and the decision design. Because if you want to provide, for example, in Cultist Simulator, there's an office job you can gradually get promoted through the ranks of. And there's, you can put your resources into getting promoted. If you get to the board level at the top, then you have to be careful keeping your occultist activities on the down low, because too much notoriety will have you thrown out in your ear. You've got a prick boss you're likely to meet halfway up, who you can either wait to retire or give up on the job or try to get assassinated. And all these things, have resource relationships with other elements of the game, that they will consume notoriety, or they produce funds, or they'll need an agent or a spirit to murder the prick boss or whatever. But trying to balance the job so that it is narratively interesting, that is a temptation to step aside from your cultistic activities, but it's strategically useful as an option you can take, is, while making sense in terms of allowing the player to discover the things they can do, is a tricky balance. It's easy to make it, if you make it tempting, it often becomes overpowered. Yeah. If you find ways to make it less tempting by having attending the job stamp on being a cultist, that can make a powerful narrative point about giving up your dreams to pursue your day job. But then the focus of the game drifts away from all the stuff about connecting the dots of the lore and finding lore in textbooks and summoning spirits that I put together. So making the resource system and the balance work in the context of the story is a constant juggling act.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. And as you said, with all these different little like story atoms floating around, it does have to at some point, add up to a meaningful experience for the player. If anything and everything can happen, then it can be very hard to feel like what they've done actually mattered. And that's kind of where that roguelike push and pull comes into play.
This is exactly it. I for a long time I talked about. I used to use the phrase quality-based narrative to describe what I did, which I never liked because that sounds like I mean quality in the sense of it being high quality, which isn't what I meant. Quality-based narrative, I meant that there are qualities, there are states, resources, variables in the game that determine which story atoms are available, which storylets are available, and then there's a virtuous circle where you have some qualities, some resources. Those cause story atoms to appear, and then you engage with those, and those cause different resources to appear or disappear. I've started to talk about resource-based narrative because I realise that the key thing here is that the qualities are things that the player cares whether they have or not. So there may be resources in there that the player doesn't care whether they have or not, their scenery or their flavour. But ultimately, in Cultist Simulator, for example, you really care whether you have enough money or whether you have enough lore, or whether your notoriety is not so high that or your despair, your dread rather, is not so high that you're going to be arrested or go insane. And those align with the theme of the game. The game is about being a cultist. Being a cultist is about trying to learn things about the secret world and trying to manage your notoriety and your dread so you don't go insane. So that fits, right? The resource model matches the narrative, and we have narrative consonants, and everyone's happy. And I think, so yeah, as you said, the roguelite, I guess, elements of this provide a model for resources to plug into and to pop out of, and that's ultimately what makes people care about the narrative. So one of the issues with Forward London we always had is because I was really at the very, very beginning of my design journey when I started building the game, and then I had to live with it for the next 7 years, and it's still running now, 9 years later. I provided a lot of very careful and effective writing and hired other people to employ careful and effective writing. And it was all resource-based, but the economic model was so out of whack constantly that people would often end up grinding the same bit of narrative over and over again, and would lose interest in the 3 paragraphs of carefully crafted prose, or would play a bit of prose and not be interested in it because it didn't give them a bit of resource I want. So I think what you really want in this kind of setup is the concerns of the narrative to be the concerns of the resource model, because that means if you can get that right, mm-hmm. people are always reading text they care about by definition, because the text is always tied to resources. But of course, that's easier said than done.
Definitely. Now, one thing we didn't talk about that I want to touch on, Alexis, is the actual aesthetic of the game. Now, for people who haven't played the game yet, you went with a tabletop approach or a tabletop look and feel for Cultist Simulator. Was this something that was always in the back of your mind when you were coming up with a concept, or did this come about during like the pre-production phase?
I can't remember whether it was in my mind at the very earliest stage, but I mean, the very first prototype was grey boxes on a web page. But certainly very early, I was thinking in these terms. And what initially I was thinking of was something like a board game or a sort of croupier tray with like a base table with squares marked on it. And I wanted tokens and I wanted cards, because those two reasons. Firstly, simply budgetary. If you have tokens, if you have flat 2D art or simple 3D models that just look like 2D art, that brings your art cost way down. I mean, you don't have to worry about physics, you don't have to worry about a lot of complexities that gains the more verisimilitude you'd have. So that's one side of it. And the other side of it, which is different but related, is that it provides the space between the fires. So again, it provides opportunity for the player to interpret what's on this card, the limited text that comes out of it, and then use that to have as a tool to have an experience, in the same way that you use a board game as a tool to have an experience. So that was significant. And the third thing, I guess, was that one of the things about board games is all the mechanics are exposed. And in Cultist Simulator, the mechanics aren't as exposed as they are in a board game, because the computer's doing things, the software's doing things behind the scenes. But they are deliberately meant to be exposed. You're meant to be able to understand the cause and effect relationship. Understanding the cause and effect relationship is a lot of the part of playing the game. So by leaning into a board game metaphor, I wanted to signal up front that this is something you're expected to understand. It's not just an impressionistic experience that's going to throw stuff at you. Learning the rules is part of playing the game. And when I started working with my UI designer, so we've got a freelance UI designer over in Germany, Martin Nerokar, and Martin convinced me very early on to move away from it being like a game board with specific locations, specific tokens on, to being something like a card table where you can place any token at any point at any time. So that's brought its own problems. Managing all the cards on the table is now a UI challenge and a quality of life challenge, but it gives the player a lot of expressive freedom to place things where they want and to manage essentially a collection of cards. And it means that now I'm at the point of iterating on the content, and I'm nearly finished editing all the content. It's very, very easy to move and change content, because it's all the recipes and the cards specified in the content engine. I don't have to worry about changing the physical assets in the game, so I can iterate on that very quickly and add post-launch updates in DLC much more easily, because all we need is more text, more 2D art, and the recipes to tie them together. We don't need to add more elements to the board. It's not like a box set where you have to bang a board on the side. Mm-hmm. So it came in early. I don't know if it came in at the very beginning.
Great. And for people watching us or listening to us right now, the art for the game, in terms of like the cards and the various elements.
Sorry, I've lost you on sound. Oh, yeah, we have.
Okay. What I was saying was, in terms of like the art that you have for like the general aesthetics, what kind of like the art style for Cultist Simulator, was this something that you came up with or you wanted very early on, or did you go through several different aesthetics or themes before you settled on this one?
So my big weakness is the visual. I'm a very verbal, abstract thinker. I'm a writer, and I'm incapable of putting two colours together on a page and making them look not like someone's barfed. So again, the freelancer early on, Catherine Unger, who's a very talented freelance artist in the UK, I asked her to do me some treatments for a style that would be easy to do quickly and would be distinctive. And she came up with the approach we've got of these I'm just going to turn the light on because I seem to be very ghostly in the dark here. Right, so she came up with the art style, and since then, three other artists, the two artists over at Clockwork Cuckoo, who picked up when Catherine, who's very much in demand, ends up on another project, and Lottie Bevan, my co-founder, who's done some of the art at our end as well. It's such a distinctive, such a simple style that it's relatively easy to crank out 2D art that looks distinctive but fits that aesthetic. So my involvement in the aesthetic was limited to saying, please can we have an aesthetic that is easily reproducible and that other artists can come on board and add to without it looking stylistically distinct. And I think, in that respect it works. It's quite hard to tell who did which art now.
Good. Now, I think with that said, I'm doing a quick time check. We are about 35 minutes in, so we'll go for maybe like another 20, 25 thereabout. That works for you, Alexis?
I've got to disappear in exactly 12 minutes, I'm
Okay.
afraid.
All right. In that
So
case,
exactly
uh,
half past.
all right. In that case, I'll get to some of my final questions. And again, if you're free in the future, we can always have you back on for follow-ups. But with that said, though, some of the major
I would
points.
love to. It's especially after May.
Mm-hmm. But with that said, though, some major points I wanted to ask you about, Alexis. First off, as we talked about before the stream, Coal Simulator first appeared on obviously Kickstarter and then to itch.io and now going to be on Steam. What was the decision to launch the game originally on itch.io as opposed to just going directly to Steam?
So, I've always made games in the open. Fallen London was in alpha like 2 months into development and beta 4 months into development. That was my first game. Sunless Sea was in early access after the back of beta. I don't really know any other way to make games than taking feedback from the community. Some of the names of which I recognise in the chat here, so hello folks, and thank you very much for making the game much, much better than it would be without you. So I wanted to get back a feedback, but I didn't want to go the early access route for two really specific reasons. Reason one is I think there's two reasons to do early access. One is for money and the other is for feedback. And I wasn't making the kind of game that was going to earn a chunk of money on early access. And early access is not what it was 3-4 years ago anyway. You really have to have a much higher standard of game to make any significant change from that. And for feedback, I thought it's easier just to do it on itch. We will get enough feedback from our backers, because we had 5,000 backers. That was more than I expected originally, and another few hundred each purchases. That will give us a steady trickle of new players who will keep on giving us feedback. So if it's feedback that we care about, we've got the Kickstarter backers, we got itch. Opening the doors on Steam, at best, it would give us an unpredictable amount of feedback. At worst, it would dent our commercial launch and make it that much harder to do good business in the first week of Steam. So I think it's very tempting to push a game out into early access and want to add. So obviously, those are the two things. The other thing is just that I like working to deadlines. And as I said, Cultist Simulator was meant to be an experiment. You know, we put it out, launches, we see people's reaction to it. I cheat a little bit on this because I say then we do post-launch updates and DLC, so it's not done forever and left. But I really wanted to work to a clear end date. And having a full launch on Steam be that clear end date is a way of focusing the mind.
For sure. And for folks watching this right now, you are scheduled to have it out by May 31st as of right now, correct?
That's right, yeah.
All right.
So we're still slightly nervously still on schedule for that.
Great. Now, one thing that you just mentioned, Lex, I also wanted to elaborate on, is what you're playing for the post-release DLC or post-release content. Because I remember one of the big marketing plugs for the Kickstarter on itch.io was the early Founders Edition that gets free DLC or the free post content. I guess for after the launch, what are you teasing to come with Cultist Simulator in the future?
One of the core ideas of Cultist Simulator was the loop that you get with legacies, with end and start conditions, so that you can die, you can be imprisoned, you can experience multiple kinds of ascension, you can retire happily, you can retire wealthily, and some of these things are in the game, some of them are not quite yet. But those open up different legacies, so different sets of starting conditions. The vast bulk of the game, with each start condition, is identical, but the beginning gives you different resources, a different narrative, which means the pitching time is different. So the big thing is to add more of these starting conditions, and if each starting condition comes with one or two cards that do unique things, then that gives us a wide variety of experience. That's the thing I most want to do with DLC. And the idea, we'll see how this works, the idea is to take a mini Paradox approach. So we do some free updates and we do some DLC alongside this. So we say, okay, we're putting out the Ghoul Legacy, where you're digging people up from graveyards. And then we put out some extra, as a piece of DLC, and they put out some extra death-related content alongside that. But I have a on my design spreadsheet, I've gradually been pushing back things into the post-launch period for weeks and weeks and weeks as time narrows, because cutting is a healthy part of any design process. One of the things I'm particularly keen to do is add rivals to the game. So this is in the original design. We won't make it in for launch, but I want to make it possible for you to mistreat your cultists enough. They set up on their own as rival cultists, and the operators semi-adversaries in the same way as hunters, but with less direct antagonism. I want more locations in the city you could interact with. So at the moment, there's an auction house, there's a bookshop, there's a sort of a burlesque club where people often remove their skin as well as their clothing. I want more of these focal points, which could serve both the places to visit and places you can get a job, and places that you can use as the focal point for legacies as well. So there's two things mostly, but I'll see what one is the additional legacies, additional Endless Arc conditions. The other is all the other stuff that makes sense in terms of content. It feels like a cool idea, but didn't make it into launch.
Mm-hmm. Now, I know you have to get going in a few minutes, but one thing that I want to ask you before we begin to wrap things up, again, with the tabletop approach, you have a Cultist Simulator. It does open itself up to, of course, adding in new systems or new rules in future content and future support. Do you see yourself, or do you have any plans to add in original systems to the game going forward? Or do you think from a basic structural standpoint, it's going to remain consistent after launch?
I don't want to commit either way on that. I think that, what I've seen in a dozen examples of board games, of living card games, of strategy games, lots of expansions, you reach this point very quickly where it gets quite top heavy, and if you start adding systems, the balance starts falling apart. In Cultist Simulator, because of the legacy mechanic, because you could have certain things that only show up in certain games, there's some built-in defense against that, but I'm wary about adding too many disparate systems, because what I've got to now is a point where the framework works and I can very, very quickly add content to it. But if I have to extend the framework, then it becomes more complex. And there is, as of today, fresh from my IDE, 53,441 words of content in the game. So if people are playing one of my games, they're not in it for the writing. They probably should be playing a different game, because we're not great on the 3D art, but we bring the words. And that means that as long as there's the kind of narrative consonance that I was talking about earlier, and the writing, the story elements continue to push out the resources and consume the resources that people care about, then I think there's a lot of opportunities for adding, for example, subplots to the patrons and the cultists who are in the game, or adding more backstory to the locations that you visit on expeditions, and more disparate choices you can do that ultimately have fairly similar mechanical effects, but narratively quite distinct outcomes.
Great, and I just wanted you to know, like, because the chat's commenting that due to like the glare on, like, I'm not sure if it's like a glare from the lighting, you do like a ghost right now on the stream with like how white your face looks.
I am. I'm actually dead. That's not the lighting. So.
Oh no.
Yeah, this is maybe the last conversation anyone has with me.
Oh no! Although if you are a ghost now, that means you do live forever, so you could work on the game. I tried to turn the light on. I don't know what's causing it. Well, if you are a ghost now, that means you are immortal, so you could work on the game for the rest of time.
I can honestly think of worse fates. I can think of better ones. I can think of much worse ones.
All right. Well, I know you have to get going in the next few minutes. I won't keep you too long, especially if you are a ghost now. So, as NerdCloud just said, Cultist Simulator 2355. Yep, exactly. That's going to be... Be sure everyone to stay around for that one. But... before we get going for tonight, Alexis, is there anything relating to Cultist Simulator that we didn't touch on that you'd like to bring up before we say goodnight?
No. I think this is kind of the basis. I would love to come and talk more. The next 5 weeks are going to be pretty hectic, but if you've got a slot from June onwards, then that would be optimal.
All right. Well, in that case, it was a pleasure hanging out with you this afternoon for me, this evening for you. Definitely the best of luck with wrapping up Cultist Simulator. Again, it sounds like such an amazing theme for a game, and I can't wait to check it out when we get closer to launch, and of course, what comes after.
Cool.
All right.
Okay, thanks very much.
All right, not a problem. So, with that said, Alexa, if you won't mind holding on site for like 1 minute, I just have a few last-minute questions to ask you once we wrap up the stream.
Sure.
But for you folks watching this live or recorded right now, thank you so much for tuning in. Again, we're going to try to get Alexis on, whether in a physical form or ghost form, after the launch of Cultist Simulator. We'll see how things go there. But if you are new, be sure to check back for daily discussions on game design here and on Game Wisdom, where we examine the art and science of games. If you like discussing game design with us, you'll find a link to our Discord down below. And if you're watching this recorded in the future, if you want an ad-free version of this talk and early, be sure to check out patreon.com/GWBlazer to find out how. But with that said, I will let Alexis go for now. I'll be back on later tonight for regular game streams. And be sure to check back with me daily for more discussions on game design here and on Game Wisdom, where we examine the art and science of games. Do you have anything you want to say to the fans before we let you go for today, Alexis?
I'm sorry about the card stealing bug. It's fixed and it will not resurface.
All right. Well, again, best of luck to you, Alexis. We'll hopefully chat again in the future. But for everyone else, have a great night, and I will see you all real soon with more design discussions and game streaming. Until then, have a great afternoon.